Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event, Zeitgeist Poetry, Writing That Speaks to the Moment. My name is Amanda St. Marie, and I sit on the board of directors for the new quarterly literary magazine. I am pleased to welcome you to our 10th annual Wild Writers Literary Festival, which is brought to you by Wordsworth Books, the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and the New Quarterly. Before we begin, I would like to extend our heartfelt thanks to our festival donors and sponsors, including the Ontario Arts Council, the NAP Wealth Management Team of RBC Dominion Securities, and Audi Kitchener-Waterloo. One thing to note before I introduce our moderator is that the chat has been turned off for this event. If you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A located at the bottom of your screen. I will be monitoring the Q&A window throughout the event and will save questions for the panelists to answer at the end of their discussion. Now I am pleased to introduce today's moderator, Sarah Ime Tien. Sarah is the author of the following poetry books: Status Update, which was nominated for the Pat Lowther Award, and the Gerald Lampert Award-winning Sweet Devilry. Her new book, Grappling Hook, is forthcoming with Pemplicit Press. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. A little bit of a tongue twister. She has been wildly anthologized in such collections as Best Canadian Poetry 2013, Poet to Poet, and the Newborn Anthology. She is the editor of the poetry collection Desperately Seeking Susans and the poetry editor for Arc Poetry magazine. Sarah currently works as the creative director for Poetry and Voice and teaches in UBC's optional residency MFA. And now to begin the event, I will turn things over to Sarah.
Thank you so much. I'm going to start by introducing our panelists here, and then we're going to jump right in. So we have Selina Boan and her debut poetry collection, Undoing Hours, which was released this spring with Nightwood Editions. She's been published widely in such collections as the Best Canadian Poetry 2018 and 2020. She's the recipient of the 2017 National Magazine Award for Poetry and was a finalist for the 2020 CBC Poetry Award. Selina is currently a poetry editor for Rahila's Ghost Press, which is an amazing press, and is a member of the Growing Room Collective. We also have Evelyn Lau. Evelyn Lau has authored 13 books. Her memoir, Runaway Diary of a Street Kid, was published when she was 18 and has been made into a CBC movie starring Sandra Oh. Her poetry has won numerous awards and her prose has been translated into a dozen languages. Evelyn was the poet laureate for the city of Vancouver from 2011 to 2014. And last but not least, of course, we have Jen Sookfong Lee, who was born and raised in Vancouver's East Side, and she now lives with her son in North Burnaby. Her books include The Conjoined, nominated for the International Dublin Literary Award, and a finalist for the Ethel Wilson Fiction Prize. The Better Mother, a finalist for the City of Vancouver Book Award. The End of East, The Shadow List, and Finding Home. Jen acquires and edits for ECW Press and co-hosts the literary podcast Can't Lit. So now that we're all suitably intimidated by the reams of awards and accomplishments, let's move on and hear some poetry from these amazing women. Jen, do you mind going first?
Of course not. I thought if I was going to go first, I was going to read the first poem in the book, but I decided I'd read the last one instead because that seems, I don't know, wrong, but right. Okay. So poem is called Stigmata. You have the mark of a witch. Turn your palms up, look closely at the middle. There, a star, a stigmata from a past life when you were thrown into a winter cold river, left to sink if you were merely human, dragged out and hung for evil if you floated. The rapids were vicious, yet in your fists were sprigs of rosemary that you tore from the bush as the men carried you out of your cottage and through the garden. For memory, you thought, so they will not forget their shame. As you drowned, the jagged, woody ends pierced the skin on your palms and you saw the blood swirl upward to the surface. White swells, red wisps that spun like baby hair and then were gone. You listen to the woman who claims she has the sight. She asks, "Are you a conjurer?" And you say to your surprise, "Yes." There were the imagined men you wrote into poems who then became real. There was the restlessness that you wrote into your novel, and when your marriage died, you wondered what you had called into being. There is your father, your grandfather, and especially your grandmother. Once, well past midnight, you opened your eyes and the neighbor's porch light spilled over the edge of the bed. It was here your grandmother sat, perched like a gargoyle slowly coming to life. By then, she had been dead for 25 years. She said, "They never knew me. They thought I was cruel." Silent, you watched her cry transparent tears. You wondered if you should touch her, but you knew that your hand would open and close and grasp nothing at all. In the morning, you couldn't remember how she had left. Maybe she walked, maybe she faded away. Maybe she kissed your forehead before flying out the window, nimble and weightless. Cradling your hands in her lap, the seer asks another question. Do you get everything you want? You hesitate. No, but yes. She looks at your face, eyes following the lines of your mouth set hard in your jaw. Did he hurt you? Does he scare you? And you don't bother answering because you both already know. He hurt you many times on purpose and by accident. The intent never mattered. You resolve to write a poem that wishes him away, a place where the desert grows truncated pine trees, bushes that are gray-green against the dust rising every time a car passes on the 2-lane highway. He'd like it there. As far as the eye can see, he will be the tallest one. In the cramped living room, her 3-year-old dancing to a cartoon on the television behind you, she traces your lifeline with her fingernail. So many slashes here and here. She takes a sip of water and then, were you a child? What happened? Before you can reply, she whispers, "Oh, I'm so sorry." She turns your hand to the side. There is another marriage in your future, she smiles. This time you'll be happy. He's been waiting for you. Someone is smoking weed in an upstairs bedroom and you blink against the smell. Well, you say, where can I find this man? She passes you a slice of apple taken from a plastic container shaped like a bunny's head and laughs. You're the witch, you tell me. That's it.
Oh man, that's so good. Okay, excellent, thank you. Selena, could you go next for us?
Yeah, I'm so happy to hear you read that poem also. It's so nice to get to hear things that you've read in orally. I just wanted to ground myself really quickly and just say like Tansei Selena Gasan. So hi, my name is Selena. And I'm mixed, so I'm white settler and nehiyaw Cree. And on my dad's side of the family, the Cree side of our family, my Cookham comes from Waterhen Lake First Nation, and my Namusa, my grandfather, comes from Flying Dust First Nation, which are 2 reserves in northern Saskatchewan on Treaty 6. But just for context, I didn't grow up in those communities. I grew up with my mom, who is a white settler on the lands of the Cowichan people. And today I'm on the beautiful lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-waututh. I just wanted to ground and do all that good stuff, and I'm going to read a short poem, and then I'm so excited to hear from Evelyn. Okay, the poem I'm going to read is called Run the Hurt. Run the hurt. Run the hurt through water, through grass, along the river where reeds brush blood, skin, pus, where pain lets itself out little by little. There are words you don't want to write, a shape of history denied so many times. Violence forms a country. If you are hurting, if you are uncertain, know that this body can hold itself to itself and undo at the same time. It is your grandmother lying in bed underneath a blue wool blanket, an article she cut from the newspaper, waiting for you beside the sink. It is Cookham saying, "Kisakitan" with her hands, stitching beads to a leather purse you will one day hold. It is your questions to her on love, sovereignty, just washed hair, learning in Nehewewin that verbs are at the center, how we move through this world, a heart, blue, red, yellow flowers circling each other, is to feel, shake, kiss, to love so fiercely it is a sky. And it's storming in Vancouver, so I thought that was appropriate with the sky.
It's so beautiful. I love that one. Thank you so much, Selena. Evelyn, can we hear from you, please?
Thank you, Selena and Jen. Earlier, we were all talking about the weather because the few of us live in Vancouver and we are in the middle of a storm. So extreme weather. This is from another season. It's called Tinder Dry. This time, the silence goes on for weeks. In dreams, you write epics, ink dripping onto vellum, a flight of blackbirds, the land of the subconscious, lush as a rainforest. Summer started 2 months early and never went away. Everyone's too hot to move, gasping in the particulate air. The arrow bobbing into the red zone of extreme, each of us in our fire towers, scanning the horizon for a spark. Yesterday, you scuffed a heap of leaves underfoot, charred and chocolate brown in the first week of July. The trees have shrunk inward, conserving their cores by shedding even their branches, snapping off, slamming down on parked cars. Hundreds of wildfires across the province, and our own small green world, bordered by blue, has become an inverted bowl, choked with smoke. Sand in the eyes, a scorched throat, each breath a slow burn, each exhale a smudge of charcoal. This air so parched and strange, your hands shake. You strain to sip some oxygen from the clogged atmosphere, cough and cough in the porous light. The maples along the seawall, gone white like soda ash, heaps of salt. The beaten metal, copper and aluminum of the sea. You wake to a room all gold, walls painted gold, furniture cast in gold. Sunlight shot through a brocade of smog. Someday soon, you think, the words will leave you, but you'll still be here. Thank you.
I love that. I can't imagine anybody else coming up with a brocade of smog. It's just so brilliant. Okay, so I have some questions about your books, which I felt all really complemented each other. Because it felt to me like all of your books were both extremely personal and in the moment, so to speak. And I was thinking, because you're writing about your own life now, it seems to me that maybe your poems naturally reflect what's going on in society. So I was wondering if, with the subject of our panel here, writing in the zeitgeist, that also means that writing in the zeitgeist is kind of writing that's confessional or close to the bone. And I want to know, did you feel as though you were reflecting larger societal anxieties and trends while you were writing, or was it just you write what's within you, and then because you live in society, it's that kind of reflection? Evelyn, yeah, please.
Can I answer that? Yeah, I mean, I've always been drawn to work that is more inward looking, but of course, the fact is that we live in the world, right? And so what's happening around us is always permeating our work, even when we're looking inward. It doesn't have to be specifics. It doesn't have to be the specifics of politics or celebrity or the news, but it can be something like weather, or how the weather mirrors our moods, or vice versa. And I think there's that. I'm always drawn to work where things are not necessarily named, but the mood and the atmosphere of the world that you live in saturates the work. And at the same time, I'm also drawn to the idea of remove, of being sort of in society, but slightly removed from it, which is, I think, a lot of writers feel like they're observers a lot of the time, right? So I guess it's a mix of different things, but I think because I am more drawn to the interior, that's always a strong feature. And yet at the same time, I think it must be said that it can be dangerous to assume that the work is autobiographical, right? Just because it seems so emotional or transparently personal doesn't necessarily mean it is, right? We can be taking on a persona that we are interested in. So
yes, yeah, absolutely. I guess part of it, when I say extremely personal, is it feels like all of your books have an emotional truth to them, that whether or not it's being represented by a persona or by metaphor, I feel like there's something there that grounds it, that makes it true in a way that only poetry can be true. You know, there's not that, to me, there's not that barrier of artifice in all of your works. It just really made me feel as though I could be close to the work. Jen or Selena, do you have any thoughts about this idea of whether or not you feel like it's not at all kind of conventional writing or writing close to the bone, or if you feel like you were writing more to societal topics?
Well, I've been asked this question a lot, just in general. And with all of my books, I think there was always an assumption I was writing about myself, even when I was writing fiction. And there was a time, 15 years ago where I would have really bristled at the idea that anyone would even ask me that, because it just assumes things about me or about the characters that I'm writing or whatever. But now that I'm a lot longer in the tooth, let's be honest. I will say that I'm less interested in even that kind of like separation of self and the products of our art. Like it doesn't matter to me what people think about it anymore. You can think it's me or you don't have to think it's me. Your relationship with my work makes no difference to how I'm going to approach it in that sense. In other ways, yes, but in that particular sense, it's not going to make much of a difference to me. Having said that, when I was writing the Shadow List in particular, I was going through like some really big sort of like life changes. And, like my marriage was over. I was like facing down being a single parent, and I was just so mad all the time, like just angry, like, what is this? And I live in Vancouver, which is like too expensive, and I was terrified I wouldn't find a house for my son and I, and all of that stuff. And then I thought all of these things are feelings that I think a lot of people, particularly women, particularly racialized women, feel all the time, this rage, but are we allowed to speak it into the air? So that was what the premise that I was working on. And my narrator, I don't make things very easy for her. She's extremely angry. She's ashamed of her desires, but also really needs to put them out there. So I think I was working with this idea, like, as an Asian Canadian woman, am I allowed to write a certain kind of rage or a certain kind of desire? What if I don't want to write about piano lessons? Like, what if I don't? Because I don't.
I think rage is so much of what we've all been feeling. So I think you really did manage to capture the moment there, because I think we're all barely contained, simmering vats of toxic rage. Or that might just be me, I'm not sure. Me and you, Jen. Selena, what do you think?
Yeah, just to respond a little bit to what Jen was saying, I think I really appreciate your work because it is unapologetic. And I think that is a very important thing. And I feel like I'm seeing it more and more, but I think I feel very empowered by that. And so anyway, I feel like I'm in a room with like many idols. So I'm like, ooh, this is very exciting for me. But I think in response to that, my book is very personal. The Undoing Hours, I'm gonna plug it here, buy it, it's beautiful. No. I'm trying to get better at self-promotion. I'm terrible at it. But yeah, it's a very personal book to me. And I think there are ways in which, and I've talked about this a few times as well in relation to my book, and sort of what you're touching on is this sort of like idea of like a spine of a poem, like the feeling, like the core of the poem is a particular feeling. And I think in whatever way that you maybe engage with language to achieve that particular feeling or emotion or mood, I think for me, that's the sign of a successful piece of art in general. For me, like, did I feel something? And if I did, whether it's a reaction maybe the author was intending or not, I still think it's successful. It's something that I talk about a lot with like students when teaching poetry, because they get very intimidated and they're like, I don't get it. And I'm like, you don't have to get it. Like, you can just have it feel like, have that feeling there. And when I was working on this manuscript, one of my mentors, Rita Warner, who this was originally like my baby thesis master's at UBC, and she was incredible because she went into my thesis meeting, she had read this manuscript, and she said no. Like, she was like, you're not, like, where are the blood and guts of you in this book? And she's like, I can't feel you. I can feel that you're holding back in some way. And there's this sort of interesting tension, I think, in, thinking about being mixed, being also an Indigenous writer, and being asked sometimes, I think, to perform the said blood and guts of the lived reality of residential schools and trauma and legacies of that in your life. So there was this really like delicate dance I think I was playing around sort of protecting myself and the stories that are mine and my family's, while also conveying, I think, like those realities too, and getting to like the emotional core of them. I don't even know if that made sense. I've had now too much coffee, but hopefully that captures a little bit of what I'm trying to say.
That made total sense. And I really appreciate you talking about that delicate balance, because I think that that's something that definitely all poets have to deal with too, the idea of how much do you expose in order to be able to really dig down through to the emotional truth. And sometimes it's a lot and sometimes it's a very little bit, right? Yeah, that's excellent. Okay, I have a bit of an easier question for you now, because your writing does seem to me so immediate. And I know that a part of this is just because you're all really, really good writers, so we don't see all of the sweat that goes behind it. I was just wondering, how often do you write? Like, do you write do you have a strict practice where you sit down and you write at a certain time each day, or do you write when you feel something? Like, what calls you to a poem and to your practice and to making these books that end up feeling so immediate? Evelyn.
I find poetry so different from prose in that regard. I mean, it just does not lend itself to, forcibly sitting down and writing for a dedicated number of hours every day. I don't personally know any poet who does that. And I miss that element, I think, of predictability that comes with prose, or that element of, if I just work at it, if I just plant my butt in the chair, the words will come. And that is the antithesis of poetry for me. So that notion of just kind of waiting for inspiration, unfortunately, poetry does have an element of, you're walking around waiting for the lightning bolt to come out of the sky. And walking does become a huge part of it. Like, I'm just constantly walking in circles and muttering to myself and looking around and seemingly probably to everybody else, lost or idle. But in fact, I'm trying to kind of create that space of, whether it's a kind of emptiness or a sort of paying attention to my surroundings and erasing myself, whatever it is that poetry seems to call for at the moment. I'm always trying to sort of create that environment for it. To the untrained eye, it looks like, I don't know what it looks like, homelessness probably, but yeah, it's a lot of circling around and trying to pay attention to the small things in daily life, but also having to really humble yourself and realize that sometimes it can be weeks of doing that and the words aren't coming. But when they do come, those weeks of just walking and thinking have laid the groundwork for the poem. But I'm curious to see how that compares with how Selena and Jen work.
Jen, let's hear from you, because you also write prose.
Yeah, I think Evelyn's quite correct. Prose is one of those things where you can sit down at a time and be like, I'm going to write a scene where the protagonist does this, says this, and then the reader is going to feel something. And you can, and I do write like novels and nonfiction that way. I don't tend to schedule my writing time more than a week in advance, because otherwise I get a little overwhelmed. So on Sunday night, I sit down and I think, okay, this day I'm going to do this work and this day I'm going to do that work. Poetry for me, the way this particular book came together was that I literally started writing poems at night after everyone in my household had gone to bed, like in the basement with a quilt over my body, because it was quiet and damp and that seemed fine. And it was not because I felt like I needed to write poetry necessarily. It was a lot of different things. My son was really little. I only had like sort of shorter pockets of time. Like a novel, you sometimes need 4 hours a day to sit there and get something substantial done. So, and I've always written. I don't have much of an identity when I'm not writing. It's strange, kind of sad. And so when I was writing these poems that sort of with these small pockets of time, And also, like I said, though, I had some huge life changes happening at that time, and I really felt a need to document it in some way, parts of it, and so no, I did not purposely set out to write a book. I will say, though, that once I got to editing or revising, I could schedule that time, and that was really good because that spoke to what I understood from writing fiction. So yeah, the revisions and the edits, I could definitely say today on Thursday, we're going to revise, Stigmata and introduction, and I could get it done. But the actual generation of that first draft was definitely never scheduled.
Right. So what you really needed was quiet and damp.
Darkness, dampness, and a quilt. It's all we all need.
That's all poets need, in case you're trying to with the quilt right over. I love that. I love that image. Selena, did you need quiet and damp? What's your process?
I'm gonna try that. I built fort. No, I wish. That would be amazing though. Like
that would be really great.
I'm very into it. No, weirdly, I think I haven't written as much prose. Obviously, I was talking a little bit. I did have the great privilege of doing an MFA, which affords you time, which is pretty amazing. So the first sort of like iteration of this book was my thesis. And then I rewrote the entire book, if I'm being honest, once I graduated. It's interesting what sort of like institutional spaces did to my writing a little bit. And it was, to be honest, sort of nice to have a break from that and be like, okay, I'm reconnecting with like the self. But I would say mine was more scheduled, actually. I like am a very big, I think in the way that I need space for like ideas or lines to generate. Like I have, my iPhone and I just take a ton of notes, and often I will just sit down and sort of start to piece them together. I would say though, the poems that I personally love the most are sort of those poems that did just come out of me. Like they weren't planned. I didn't like sit down to write. It's interesting though, I'm starting to venture. I'm like hoping to begin work on my first novel. And it's interesting hearing sort of those differences. And I think I'm excited to sort of go into a world that I'm creating that isn't perhaps, it's still tied to me, obviously, because I'm writing it, but isn't so close to me. Like I feel, I got really, I think it was very emotionally exhausting writing this book. It was a lot of like self-work. It required a lot of like, okay, we're going to write this poem today. Yeah. Anyway,
yeah, I kind of write more like you, Selena, actually. And Evelyn, I might be that one writer that does it because I have to have a deadline to write, and I only ever write in a panic because somebody expects me to. I have a writing group and I only ever write for them. I like never get inspired. I think I've been inspired 3 times in my life. So I literally just sit in front of my computer. I'm like, well, you better think of something. And then that's how I write. so yes. Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about, and I know again we're going to walk that line of what is a character and what is confessional. But Jen, your poem, The White Lie, and the companion poem, I'm assuming the companion poem, when you read his poems, are about writing about other people. And you have an interesting line in the poem, The White Lie, which is, your old marriage runs like an underground river through everything. So I love this because it shows how people show up in poems, even when we maybe try to hide it or when we're not necessarily trying to make the poem about them. And I also love how you assert that you will lie when you assure your lover, I will never write about you, because I think that all writers do that. Selena, your poems also address your father, your cousins, roommates, and Evelyn, whether again it's a character or yourself, you talk about mother and family feature prominently in your poetry. So I'd like to know how each of you approach writing about others. What's important to you in representing the people you write about? What do you feel you owe or don't owe the people who appear even as an undercurrent in your verses? Evelyn.
Oh God, I've wrestled with this topic for years. In my 20s, I got into a lot of trouble for writing about, a particular person in my life, another writer, and the fallout of that, went on for some time, and certainly went on much longer in terms of my own maybe reticence or, increasing inability to write prose. I mean, I found a kind of sanctuary in poetry because, I loved how you put earlier, Sarah, you were saying how, there is no hiding in poetry. I mean, it is, that kind of emotional transparency is so immediate. And yes, I'm so drawn to that. It seems like my whole life I've been sort of digging, looking for that emotional honesty. But it seems like it's acceptable in poetry in a way that is really difficult to facilitate in prose without drawing a lot of negative attention, or anything from criticism to to people actually taking offense and wanting to act upon that. Poetry sort of, my last 8-9 books have been poetry as a result. I mean, I just I decided when I couldn't write prose anymore to turn all of that into poetry, that impulse, because of course we don't live in a vacuum, right? So we are going to write about whether it is, partners or family or, and trying to navigate that. And I don't know. I mean, like, there's so, I've literally spent years thinking about this. And I mean, basically the short answer is I think poetry allows for it in a way that prose comes under such a different level of scrutiny than poetry does. And I have felt able to write more explicitly about those relationships in poetry in a way that I no longer felt I could in prose.
It's funny how with prose, with fiction, we say, okay, this is a made up story. And then everybody assumes everything is true. And then in poetry, we're like, this is nonfiction. And everybody's like, it's okay. It's all just metaphors anyway. I wonder why it is seemingly easier to not get away with, but to represent things in poetry that people will accept the emotional truth where they won't in other things. Selena, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm just formulating a thought in my brain right now, but I was gonna say, I think there is a way in which you have an emotional core, but I think it is easier to hide in the language of poetry. And I think especially when you're sort of like bending words in particular ways, yeah, you can hide a little bit, for me at least. I haven't written a lot of creative nonfiction. It's partly because that I feel like it's a very bare, like it just feels too close. Like I don't, it feels very, very vulnerable to me. Like I'll have, some people will read my work and be like, oh my gosh, this is so vulnerable, blah, blah, blah. But it's so like, I guess that's the same for nonfiction at a certain point. Like it's very crafted though. Like my poems, everything in them is just so intentional, right? So that I have decided the way that you're going to perceive a particular event or moment that was really emotional for me. And I think that is also kind of empowering too. But yeah, come back to me. I'm still formulating.
Okay. Jen.
I will say that I think poetry doesn't come under that same scrutiny, partly because what I would call like readers of people don't really read poetry in the same way. There's not that many of them, let's be honest, like readers of poetry, like it. So
there's the 200 of you.
Yeah. So like this particular book where I may have written a bunch of nasty stuff that I may have thought or did at some point in my life. Literally no one who's related to me ever read it. So it didn't matter. They didn't even come to the launch. They were like, whatever, Jen, write another novel, please. And that's fine. But I also think the thing about so with my fiction, my first novel, The End of East, was heavily sort of drawn from the history of my family and, my sisters and my mom. And I've been very lucky. My mother does not read in English. great for me. But for like with my sisters and stuff, I was really aware that I was writing things about our family and I really wanted them to know. So I did tell them sort of ahead of time. I didn't give it to them to read because I knew that obviously their memories of certain things would be very different from mine and my story is different from theirs. And that was fine. And it was such a relief when the book came out and they loved it. They were happy for me. And I always say that if someone really loves you and they know that this is your life's work, they usually are pretty happy for you. Where you got to worry are the people who don't like you all that much or pretend to like you. So I am in final edits for a memoir now. And it does worry me a lot because I've never really written straight up memoir before. And the one thing that I have, I think for everybody who writes creative nonfiction, particularly about themselves and about the people in their lives, that there are always going to be areas of your life or people in your life that you are not going to write about, and you can have those boundaries, and that's fine and okay. And the other thing too is that the people that you love, that if you are worried that they're going to have a reaction, talking to them about it beforehand is a really great thing, which I have done with a couple of those chapters in my memoir with my one sister. The others, I have 4 sisters, so I did send it to my one sister. The other 3, apparently it doesn't matter to me. I feel like they're not. I'm kidding. But they weren't really in that essay, so it didn't matter. But yeah, so it's I honestly, it's something that I've, like Evelyn, struggled with a long time. What do I write about? Who do I write about? How do I do it? How do I do it like ethically? And I guess I just went ahead and did it. And like nothing terrible's happened yet. So that's all I can say.
So if you showed it to someone in your family and they objected to it and wanted you to change it or take it out, would you consider it, or would you, is it?
You know what, I'll actually give you an example, because it depends what it is. Because for my sister, this particular sister, she had a really hard, my dog really wants to get in on this memoir situation, but my sister for a few years really struggled with like eating disorders and body dysmorphia, and I did touch on it a little bit in that chapter. And I specifically asked her, I said, do you want me to even write this? Because I don't have to. It's not my story, it's hers, right? Like this, It wasn't me. I was just a witness to it, whatever. And she said, I'm not super comfortable about it. You can talk about me lifting weights at the gym, but not the eating stuff. And I was like, okay, we'll just do the lifting weights at the gym. But that's because I love her though, right? Like but I also felt like it didn't change that much about that particular chapter, which was how our father had died. And it was about how we were dealing with our grief in different ways. And if we wanted to recast her as just lifting weights at the gym, dealing with her grief, that was okay by me. So yeah, I did change that one thing.
Yeah. So shades of gray. Selena, what do you think?
Yes. Thank you for giving me just a moment to gather my thoughts.
Of course.
I was going to say that with writing, I approach, I think, writing for others, at least in my book. I had a process of sort of first of care, sort of as Jen is talking about, where, you're considering the folks, often people that you potentially, that you love, who you're writing about, and how to show care in your writing for them. And then, yeah, checking in with folks as well is really important. And I think as well, I went through and I combed my manuscript, and I did at the last minute change quite a few things actually that I decided, I'm actually not ready to share this, or I don't want to. And I think I tried to be pretty transparent about that. I have in the final, I have a long poem in the book, and in it, I think I say something about like, this is not the whole story. And half of the story isn't, I don't feel like mine to tell necessarily. And so I just, I feel like at this point in my life that's fine for me and people who are close to me to know that those pieces, but I didn't feel like I needed to share it in a super public way. So that's sort of what I was, there's emotional truth and emotional pain there, but the narrative itself is a little bit murky, and I'm okay with that. Like I did that intentionally, and that was partly just to show care for other people that I love.
I love that poem, actually. That's one of my favorite all-time poems. And I thought that you did that really skillfully, actually. I love how at points in your poems, you say no, like I can't find it right now because I'm just kind of like going through, but I even love, I love this part. I know you want the piece of the story that is clandestine, but I won't give it to you, and I'm not sorry. Undo word after word that tumbles out a sidewalk. Undo textbooks. Not doing you justice by reading, but it's gorgeous, and I love that you do that, and I think that that's part of the honesty in your poetry that I'm really responding to, right? Like I think that speaks to a kind of emotional depth that really just kind of resonates all throughout your poetry, that you're willing to even draw clear boundaries in your own writing. I have like a million more questions, but I've got a message here that it's actually time for the Q&A. So we'll see what everybody in the audience has been thinking. And then if there's time, I might ask you a bunch more of the questions that I have here. I'm just going to open it up here. Okay. So one question here is, how do you make commemorative, zeitgeist, or other poetry tied to specific time and events still engaging or relevant after the time or event has passed?
Oh, how interesting. Well, I think a poem is a bit like a photograph in a way, right? I mean, it captures a moment. And so the fact that it exists, that moment exists, maybe in this little bubble, doesn't matter whether it's, yesterday or 20 years ago. You open it, you look at it, and it's still there. It's still capturing that moment. Now, of course, styles do change, and I do find, when I'm revisiting, poems, not my own work, but other people's work, that it can seem dated, because the styles are no longer what we read in contemporary poetry. So, I mean, I find myself thinking about that quite a bit. There are those poems that seem to transcend the decades and speak to readers that, weren't born when the poet was writing that poem. But I suppose that's a relative rarity. I mean, I imagine, how many poets' work, now would seem incredibly sort of stilted and old-fashioned, and yet may have been avant-garde in their time, right? So yeah, I don't know. How would the two of you respond to that?
I think a lot about that Philip Larkin poem where he rails against rock and roll and like the Beatles, that we were all forced to read when we were in school. And I think, why is he allowed to do that? No, and like, quite honestly, this is something that I think about a lot, because like in this particular book, I read about like Harry Styles, or I'll read about, whatever. And there's a part of me that thinks that if I think about that issue too much, I will actually stop wanting to write what I want to write. So if we're allowed, if Philip Larkin was allowed to do such a thing, then I think we're allowed. That's all.
Nobody can tell you what to do in your writing. Selena, what do you think?
To be honest, my book I talk about this a little bit in the book, is sort of different conceptions of time in relation to different worldviews. And in Nehiyaw Cree worldview, like, we have a different conception of time that isn't linear. So I think about that. Something that could be interesting is maybe looking into your own ancestry and your own culture, and potentially like exploring sort of like how do you imagine time, or how does your family imagine time, and sort of maybe coming in from that angle. Because I think if you begin to rethink sort of like the bounds of time that we imagine, so this colonial, train time, then like everything sort of becomes interconnected and relevant, right? Because we are responding to the past and the future like all at once. I don't know, that got very philosophical, but that's sort of that's what came to mind. I'm like, time. But I agree with both Jen and Evelyn. I think, write what you feel drawn and compelled to write about. And I think that if you are passionate about something or feel something deeply, then I do believe others will as well.
Mm-hmm. And emotion is timeless, right? I mean, loss, grief, all the big things that we deal with. I mean, they transcend not just time, but culture. They transcend politics, they transcend fashion, right? I mean, those basic human emotions.
Yeah, that's what I always find when I'm reading a poem that's across culture or across time. It's the emotional ones that get me, right? Like I could be reading somebody from, I don't know, the 12th century Japan, and I'm like, oh, I feel that. I totally relate to that. It's because our feelings haven't changed really that much since we evolved into what we know as humans. Okay, another question. Someone says, what a wonderful panel. To Evelyn's point about the difference between poetry and prose, have any of your poems started life as a prose piece or vice versa? How do you help transfer an idea between poetry and prose or blend the genres?
I think in particular of one piece that turned into a long poem, but it was initially about a 30-40 page essay, personal essay, which I grappled with for a year before finally, realizing that, hey, the best lines in this actually form the skeleton of a poem. And so, yeah, that was the poem that took a year to write, basically. And, I really, Jen, what you were saying about, let's be honest here, the audiences, we're talking about, I mean, book sales literally are 200 to 300 copies, right? For every book of poetry. And that's a good
doing well.
Right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's, we're so grateful for our audiences. They, are disciplined readers. They are not casual readers, right? They're not sort of somebody who picks up a book, oh, it's on the bestseller list, I'll flip through it. No, I mean, they bring a real, they bring everything to their reading of poetry. And we appreciate that, but it is such a, when I think of the audience that I was hoping to reach with the long personal essay versus the 5 people I did reach with the long poem, there was some sadness involved in that trade-off, but but typically what I do find interesting is usually, and maybe, Jen can speak to this as well too, having written in different genres, is how it's almost an immediate, like whether something is demanding to be a personal essay versus a short story versus a chapter in a novel versus a poem. Like it's always been, actually, typically it's been very, very clear to me, and it's rare that one, because it doesn't work in one form, ends up morphing into another.
I was just going to say that, like, actually the end of Yunna's first novel was a poem. It was a long poem for a while, until it got far too long. and then I realized actually that it was a novel because there was so much more I wanted to add to it in terms of like setting and dialogue and all that other fictional stuff. Like for me, when I'm writing in different genres, often the themes are the same. Like the themes have not changed for me much. Like I've basically been writing about my mother for 25 years. She doesn't know it. It's fine. But no, I write about Vancouver. I write about the Chinese Canadian community. I write about, mothers and daughters. I write about, the rage that people feel. The themes have stayed the same and consistent. It's just that sometimes the scaffolding that a particular idea needs, it's either bigger and then it becomes a novel, or it's a little bit smaller and then it's a poem, or it has to be so much internal truth that it becomes creative nonfiction. So so the themes are the same, ideas slightly different, scaffolding completely different, I would say.
Selina, I know you've had to write different genres just because you've gone through the UBC MFA. Were you called to just write everything as poetry and then you had to kind of force it into other genres, or do you feel the same way that each piece?
I definitely actually the long poem in my book was originally a personal essay. So I definitely, or like pieces of it were. So I definitely have I do have a lot of prose that I have written. It's just I've never done anything with it, partly because for me, my personal essays were too personal. I was like, okay, this can stay in there. This is like my diary-ish vibe. But obviously some of those I had to share because we had workshops and whatnot. But partly because of that experience, I sort of realized, okay, maybe I'm not like ready to share these stories. And yeah, I think that's, yeah. So I do have some mix of genre in there.
Yeah. Let's see, this next question is also about writing about family members. So along the lines of family members in your work, how would you approach minor family members? So Jen, I'm looking at you for this one. Like if your kids are a big part of how you write, how does one handle this, or how do you?
I don't write about my son hardly at all, except he appears a little bit in some of my kids' books, like because I write nonfiction children's books, and often there's like introduction, the reason why I wrote this book, and he'll appear in those sorts of sections. Other than that, I have he just asked me if I'm talking about him. Did you all hear that? It's fine. Yes, a little bit, but not really.
You write about him quietly.
Oh my God. No, I don't actually write about him at all. And it's partly because I am aware that he will read my books eventually, maybe not right now. But eventually he's going to read my books. And I don't want him to learn about his childhood that way. Like I'd rather have a conversation with him and a dialogue. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I write about my kids like all the time, like all three of them. Like as soon as I found out I was pregnant with Theo, basically I had like a poem for every single day of my pregnancy. It's ridiculous. And how does one handle this? I don't know. I write recklessly, I guess. My daughter is now old enough that before I pass it on to a big competition, if it's about her, I'll give it to her first and I'll say, is this okay? And she's like, nobody reads poetry, go ahead. I'm like, okay, great, you get it, right? So for my son though, I'm sure that there are going to be interesting conversations about ethics and consent when he's a little bit older and starts reading my work, but I've just decided to delay that and find out later. Okay, so next question. While you are waiting for a poem to come, are there places you can go or things you can do to invite it to come more quickly? Well, Evelyn says that she walks a lot. Selena, what do you do?
I love this question. To be honest, I don't necessarily go to a place, but I am very big on music. So I write to music. I love just music in general. Typically, like if I'm actually physically writing, it'll be like music without lyrics, but I'm music obsessed. So I would say my place is music, I guess.
So do you have like a playlist for us to listen to while we're reading your excellent book? I wish I didn't have the blur undoing hours.
I should actually make a playlist. I didn't do the like cool hip thing and make a playlist for my book. But I do have playlists, but maybe I like that idea though. Maybe I'll work on one. I did have a playlist which was just like, this is the playlist that I wrote my book to. And it's just like good writing music, to be honest, if you're ever into that kind of thing. It's nice.
Oh, I want you to send that to me.
Okay.
Jen, how about you?
No, there's really not much I can do to make a poem come faster. My poems usually start with a line or an image, one thing, 3 words maybe. And sometimes I'll write the idea down and it'll stay there for a long time with no poem surrounding it. And like, that's okay. I guess no, I can do that with prose for sure. I can definitely force things out, but with poetry, it's been a little bit more difficult. I guess I need a damp, dark basement is what I need.
Yeah,
frankly.
you do. You need your quilt back over you. Evelyn, so I know you do lots of walks, but what do you do to start a poem? Jen said a line or an image. I know some poets are really sonic. How do you find your poems start for you?
Sonic.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I mean, definitely a line or image, but I find, more than anything, it's clearing the clutter out of your brain. Like, so for me, like the music, no, silence, and not having, having a period of time where I don't have anything scheduled, and not having, I don't have Wi-Fi at home. for example. So, I don't have those easy distractions. So it kind of forces me, basically, it's getting to a level of boredom, which is what people used to achieve before they had, cell phones and all this. Yeah, I don't have a cell phone either, right? So I am actually just kind of staring into space as much as I can. And that works for me in terms of inviting a poem to come in, because I find if I am cluttered, whether it's with work, deadlines, easy access to entertainment, then those are all great excuses not to write. So for me, it is finding that still, space, that kind of personal nunnery, basically is how I view it, that I can go into and be receptive. And of course, there aren't a lot of spaces like that in the world anymore, unless you actively create it for yourself.
I want to go to a writing retreat made by you guys, and there'll be like different stations. So you go to Selina's and they're like, there's the music is playing and you've got like your notebooks and you're trying to do it. And then you go to Jen's and there's like just a quilt and like a spray bottle to just keep it damp. Evelyn's like this empty white room. I feel like I could produce a lot if we did this. Okay, we have a question from Ying. Jen, have you ever talked to your mother about her role in your work? Or if she could read English, would you consult with her the way you did with your sisters?
I have talked to her about it, and it was really, I think it must have been with my first novel, and I gave her the book. She was quite happy that I produced a real book. She actually asked me if I produced them in my basement. Must have taken you so long to make all these books. It's cute. But I gave her the book, and she asked me what it was about. And I said, it's a family story about a Chinese family, kind of like ours. And she's like, oh, am I in it? And I said, well, sort of. She's like, are you nice to me in it? I said, sure, which is not really true, but like that, but it's not true either. I think that I approach writing about my mom with I try to do it with a lot of generosity because, she's my mom. But I think if she could read English, I would give her that opportunity now. I don't know that I would have done it in my 20s. We were still embroiled in a lot of conflict then. And, she's in her 80s now and she's much chiller. She just plays Texas Hold'em at the casino with young men in sunglasses. These are her words, not mine. And so I think I could do it now, but at the same time, she's actually not even asking me those questions anymore because she's so used to the books just appearing, and she has them and she looks at them and she, I think, enjoys them. So I think I would now, but I wouldn't have 20 years ago.
Yeah. Sometimes it's hard to even know if your family members are reading any of your stuff. Yeah, for me anyway. Okay, I think we have a few more minutes, so I'm just going to go back to one of the questions that I have. So one thing that struck me about each of these books is the bravery and honesty that seems to underlie every poem. So Evelyn in Pineapple Express, there's a section that deals with depression and the complex side effects of antidepressants. And Jen, your books takes on a lot of the messiness and ambivalence that comes with romantic relationships, and you touch on parenting as well. And of course, Selina, your book walks the knife edge in exploring complex family relationships and rediscovering relationships. And one of the things that I really adored about all of your writing is that while the imagery and metaphors were startling and gorgeous, the language itself has a kind of casualness to it that felt like you weren't trying to hide behind words. So it's not plain language that was used because the language was heightened and obviously chosen with deliberate care, but it was welcoming. To me, it was the language of intimacy. So I was wondering if you could talk about the tone of your books and how or whether you were trying to establish a personal connection with the reader, because I felt a personal connection while I was reading it, whether or not it was intended.
I love the way you spoke about our work. You are our ideal reader, a poet who understands both the craft and the labor that goes into the craft, but also the labor that goes into not making it seem too crafted, right? Or artificial, or so yes, I mean, I like sort of a kind of I guess that sort of conversational, intimate quality, where you feel like, you know, the poet is speaking directly to you, but at the same time in a language that is, as you say, heightened without being flowery, right? Or,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah. But it's careful, it's polished, right? But at the same time, it's close. Yeah, I want that intimacy. So yeah, I mean, that's a kind of, it's a balancing act for sure to try. And I think, you know, we're all, or, you know, the three of us here are aiming for that. And it's often poets who understand the work that has gone into, you know, creating that, yeah, that mood.
Yeah, I feel like it's the most difficult type of writing where when you look at every word, when you look at every stanza, I can just be lost in admiration for how it's crafted. But like I read the poem several times because I read the poem and it flows in a way that I get this like rush of emotion, right? With all of your writing, which is rare actually. This is a delightful panel because I love you guys. And then I read the poem again, and I read it more as a writer, thinking like, how did they do that? Like, how did they come up with these words? And I feel like I want to know more about how you do that, because it's such a difficult thing to do. Does it happen upon editing? Do you feel, how do you get that kind of conversational sense in work that is so dense with poetic, I'm losing my words here, poetic devices?
I think when I'm writing a poem, a lot of my poems are built along the rhythms of the way that I speak, which is like, I try really hard not to read poems like, you know, like the great poet will read poems in that cadence. And
I hate that cadence.
I don't know if I hate it. It's just not for me. It's a cloak that I cannot wear.
Okay.
But I think, yes, they're very much built upon the rhythm of my personal speech. And then where you get like the craft stuff is I'm always challenging myself to surprise myself with word choices or construction. And it doesn't happen every line, and it doesn't happen, like I actually have written in the margins of this book when I was editing it, not every line has to be a banger, Jen. Because it's true, you need to release the pressure sometimes. But
you do, so it can flow.
Yeah, and that's fine. Don't put the pressure on yourself to make everything a banger. It's okay. But yeah, so it's very much built, like sort of the idea of it on how I speak, but also I also want to surprise the reader, but I also want to surprise myself, because if I was just writing stuff that was just the way that I talk, I would bore myself, quite frankly.
And then it wouldn't be poetry, right?
No.
Without all of the layers that you put in. Yeah,
that's just a ranting monologue.
And you just made me laugh so hard. I've like lost my train of thought. It's so true. Oh my goodness. I'm just imagining a poem of my stream of consciousness, and it's horribly boring. Similar thing. I think I've always been really interested in like the orality of poems, and I think early like workshops and stuff that I participated in, people were like, this sounds really cool, but what are you trying to say? And I'd be like, I don't know, it just sounds so cool. So I think for me, the challenge has been really like fine-tuning that, where I'm like asking myself, okay, I'm creating a feeling here, but like, what am I trying to say? So it's like the blend of that. I had a wonderful friend of mine, Sean Robinson, do some edits for me for that book. And he pointed that out. He said, where you release that pressure of, you know, your sound and like your mixing of words, whatever, is like where then the poem really comes together. And I think creates that moment of intimacy. And so that was really helpful, because then I just was able to insert those. So I kind of actually went through and was like, okay, I'm just going to say the thing here. I'm going to say what I mean here. I'm going to say what I mean here. And that actually, I think, has been really helpful and has really changed the way that I write or approach writing. So that was, yeah.
Yeah, that's such an important thing. Like in my writing group, that's often what we talk about in a poem is we'll all read it and then we'll say, okay, what are you trying to say? And then the person will say it and it's usually beautiful. We'll say that, say the thing, and it fits into the poem so well. But so often we're kind of afraid to say the thing, right? So we write a whole poem around the thing that we're trying not to say, but it's great because it's just seamless in your book, Selena. Like in your book, I never would have thought that you had gone back and in edits you've done that, because it really feels like each poem is structured in a way that there's like a natural progression. There's an actual narrative progression often in a lot of your poems. So I think that's really interesting. This is kind of related to one of the questions that was talking about writing in the moment. And I just wanted to talk about writing technology in poetry, because I think that you guys have done some really interesting things with this. Selena, I love your poem, Emails with Nutawe. Am I saying that right?
Nutawe, yeah.
Okay, Nutawe. And Jen has a poem called Text Etiquette. And Evelyn even talks about, I believe, CSI is in your poems. There's references.
I don't think there's any technology in my poems at all.
Oh no, there's television. And so I was wondering, like, do you find there's anything different? I mean, we're all, probably most of us, when we started writing poetry, we all came to it knowing that you have to pay attention to nature and putting nature imagery into our poems. But I find that kind of weaving technology in, which is a part of our lives, and so naturally it's going to come into our poems, is a little bit different. So how do you find anything different about writing about or with technology, and how do you compare the immediacy of technological communication with the slow pace of poetry?
Oh, I find it anathema, the the relentlessness of email and so forth. And yeah, I feel so detached from all of that. Yeah, I think I remember sort of in the early days of email, like I would read novels where it just seemed like there would be reams of email correspondence within the novels, right? And I guess now there's sometimes like reams of like texts or whatever in novels. And I just find that, even if that is reflective of people's lives, it's not something I want to read, right? It lacks it lacks the element of reflection and in that attempt to capture the immediate and the contemporary, it is sacrificed to me depth. But maybe this is an old-fashioned view of things. I don't know how the others feel.
I'll be really quick about it, because I think we might be in the last minutes, but I'll be real quick.
We are in the last few minutes, yeah.
It's when I include things like text messages and emails and stuff in my writing. Not a lot, some, but the way that I look at it is, can I write about this text message in the same way that I would write a diary entry, or the same way that I would write a letter in a novel, and giving that text message the space to be what it can be, and to give it as much weight that it can hold is a really interesting exercise, because they're so short. But like also, I think when we give it that weight and that space, it kind of takes away the novelty or the speed of it a little bit, and slows it down just enough to make it sort of relevant and sort of fit into whatever it is that we're writing. That would be my answer.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
Selena?
I agree. I'll also answer quickly, but yeah, I think for me, it's just it's a part of my world, and so I'm just incorporating that into my world. It's interesting, actually, because I'm doing an education degree right now, but we've been having a lot of conversations about how literacy is changing for young people and what literacy will look like in like 20, 30, 50 years. And it's really interesting, like imagining those kind of like futures, like literacy futures where, because we have constant access to information, and how does that change how we pay attention? How does that change how we read? So anyway.
No, that is really, really interesting, because I do find that my concentration level has gone down since I've had access to technology like phones, etc. And poetry is one of the ways that I manage to kind of recapture my attention, because then I can spend some time just kind of thinking deeply about something, even if it's only 2 stanzas long. It's a page long. like it's a struggle to re-engage that part of my brain where I'm not skimming, and instead I'm trying to read deep into the poem. So I'd be really interested to see how literacy evolves and how we look at text as we start to engage more and more with technology. Yeah. Well, I know we only have 2 more minutes. I just want to say too that one of my favorite lines from this is the fact that we have so few readers, and that I love the viewers here. Just remember, we're looking for quality, not quantity. So you guys are all the quality. Everybody who's here right now, we all think you're quality.
Yeah, and I'm just going to hop in here and say thank you so much, Sarah, for your thoughtful questions and for moderating such a lovely panel. I really enjoyed listening to each of you read one of your own poems. And I loved Evelyn liking a poem to a photograph. I was like, oh, I have to write that down because I really like that. And I also love a really good playlist too, Selena. So I would be so interested in what music inspires your work. And I think that's a really cool concept of pairing a playlist with your work. So in closing, I want to remind our viewers that you can find all of the authors' books from today's panel for purchase online from Wordsworth Books. I've also put a link in the chat to visit our online book table for a handy overview of our festival authors' books. And then don't forget that there's a few other Wild Redditors literary festival events throughout this week and into the weekend. So be sure to check those out. And if you haven't, sign up for the all access pass so that you can receive the recordings from all of these events. Thank you so much again for attending tonight's event. And thank you so much to our panel. This was excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah, particularly.
Thanks,
You were lovely.
guys.
Brilliant.
So good.
Bye.
Bye.